Hello party people, what's up? Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tori. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm currently filming this like on Labor Day weekend, so now it's officially the end of summer and now I'm ready to light my fall candles and let the fall season commence. Before I really dive deep into fall, I wanted to share with you all the books that I read over the summer. I read some great books, I read a couple of duds, but it is what it is. So let's jump in. So in the month of May, I read 4 books, which is pretty strong for me. The first book that I read in May was Assembly by Natasha Brown. I don't really remember the star ratings of these books, but if you care about that, feel free to follow me on Storygraph. So the story of Assembly follows this unnamed protagonist who is a Black woman working in finance in London, and we follow her in her days right before she goes to a weekend garden party at her white boyfriend's family's home. He's a very wealthy man, and so I guess wealthy white families throw garden parties. This book is written in vignettes, so it definitely has a bit of a fragmented feel to it, but I actually really enjoyed that element of this book because of like the fragmentedness and like the things left unsaid. I kind of found myself kind of like reading in between the lines and kind of looking further into this text, especially because it is so short. Just from the synopsis, you can tell that this story deals a lot about race and a lot about class and a lot about like British colonialism. I feel like it also touches upon womanhood as well, and like the feeling of womanhood specifically that we always feel like women are on a timeline, like whether that's like your eggs and like having babies or your like career timeline or things like that. I would also just like to say that this book made me feel very claustrophobic, but in a good way. Like I felt like I was in her mind, I was in these situations with her. Honestly, the only downside is that I didn't really like the ending of this book. I felt like the ending was a bit rushed because we had spent so much time leading up to this garden party. That was like the only downside, but this book is so great. Switching gears, the next book in May that I read was Funny You Should Ask by Eliza Sussman. I know this book was really hyped up on TikTok and on YouTube, and it was really hyped up for me because one of my friends, Keely, she's kind of like my internet friend, she was really hyping this book up, so when I saw it, I was like, oh, this is the book Keely was talking about. Basically, this book follows a young Jewish writer named Chani Horowitz. Oh my god. I don't remember if it's Chani or Hani because she definitely says in the book how you pronounce her name. I believe it's Hani now that I'm saying it out loud. But this romance involves her and this actor named Gabe Parker, and basically they meet because Hani has an assignment to interview Gabe Parker ahead of him taking on the role of James Bond. The interview goes viral because people are reading in between the lines and they think like, did they hook up? Did they not hook up? And then 10 years later, Hani is asked for a follow-up interview with Gabe. Basically, it's told in like a dual timeline, so it flip-flops between the present day weekend of Gabe and Hani together and then 10 years ago. I just thought it was just a super fun read. I feel like for me, when it comes to romances, I don't have like a huge criteria that they really need to hit. It really just has to be like somewhat entertaining for me, and also like if it's going to be outlandish, I want it to at least be good. I would definitely recommend this to people who love a fluffy romance, who love fan fiction, or who love even like more like fluffy literary stuff like Anything by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I think you would really enjoy this book. But some of the parts that I really liked about this book were the banter between Hani and Gabe. There's like an anti-Woody Allen rant in this, which I really loved. And then I also really loved the subtle pop culture references in this book. I feel like when it comes to any kind of book, if the pop culture reference like is used too much to ground a story in reality, I kind of get distracted, but I think this one did a really great job. In case you didn't know, this book is also kind of inspired by a few GQ interviews. I believe there's one most notably with Chris Evans, and there's another one with Tom Hiddleston, and I'll link those in the description so you can read them. But I did know they existed because I read an interview with this author, but I didn't read those until after I finished this book, and honestly, I still had a fun time with it, so yeah. The next book that I read is City of Girls by Elizabeth Gilbert. You may know who Elizabeth Gilbert is because of the book Eat, Pray, Love, but this is one of her works of fiction, and it's actually a historical fiction, which I don't think I've ever read before, but I really enjoyed this one. So this story is told from the perspective of an 89-year-old woman named Vivian Morris, And basically she receives this letter from a woman named Angela who asks Vivian what her role was in her deceased father's life. And so Vivian is kind of recounting her life to young Angela, and she's kind of addressing us, the reader, as if we are Angela, which I thought was really fun. This story takes place in the 1940s, and we start out by meeting Vivian right after she's kicked out of Vassar College her freshman year. Oh my god, there's something in the air. Vivian's like waspy parents send her to New York City to live with her eccentric Aunt Peg. Aunt Peg owns and runs a theater called the Lily Playhouse, and so while Vivian is there, she becomes the costume designer for all of the shows. So Vivian really gets wrapped up in this world, and obviously she goes through like very interesting life experiences, and it was really fun to read about. I feel like Elizabeth Gilbert really painted a beautiful picture of New York, and it was really easy to like get lost in this world that she created. Since the story is kind of written like letters are kind of addressed to Angela and is kind of written from like this modern point of view, sometimes Vivian will interject, oh, I know this would be seen as kind of problematic now, but blah 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 blah. But I felt like those interjections were done very sparingly and very well. Honestly, the only thing I didn't like about this book was the way in which Angela and Vivian's lives intersect. But overall, I really enjoyed City of Girls. I know if you're someone who likes like reading about like a fictitious New York or things like that, you would really enjoy this book. But yeah, that's City of Girls. And then the last book that I read in May was Book Lovers by Emily Henry. And I'm going to share a very unpopular opinion. I did not really enjoy this book. To me, this book is the weakest out of Emily Henry's 3 books. This is also another book that was like super hyped up this year as well. But some of the elements that really ruined it for me was like, this is an edition I bought at Target, and I found like 4 typos within the first 40 pages. And this book also kind of used pop culture references in a way that I don't really like. Like, it used too many at once to like really set the scene immediately. And I was like, Emily Henry, I expected more from you. I think because I read her other work, my expectations are pretty high for Emily Henry. If you don't know what this book is, it's a romance with our 2 characters, Nora Stevens, who is like this cutthroat book agent, and then Charlie Lastra, who's kind of like this super intimidating book editor. The book starts out, they have like this one business meeting that really just puts them off on the wrong foot with each other. And then fast forward to the actual story, Nora and her little sister Libby end up taking a little girls trip to like this really small town called Sunshine Falls. Nora doesn't really like the small town vibe because like the last few relationships she's been in, she's lost her significant other to like little sweet like small town girlies that they met while they were like on a work trip. She's like, the Hallmark fantasy is not for me. But guess who's from Sunshine Falls? Charlie Lastra. I honestly just could not see the chemistry between Nora and Charlie. I feel like everyone was talking about how incredible their banter was, but I felt like they were talking in monologues, and I was like, normal people don't talk like this. And yes, I do suspend a little bit of belief because it is a romance book, but I think compared to like the banter that like January and Gus have, or that Poppy and Alex have in Emily Henry's other 2 books, this one just did not do it for me. I feel like a lot of people online, they were like, if you're an older sister, you're definitely going to like understand Nora. And I was like, crazy how I am the eldest daughter and I don't understand Nora at all. I have to be a contrarian sometimes, so this book just like did not do it for me. Okay, moving on to June. I only read 1 book in June, and I think it's partly because Book Lovers put me in a reading slump, but it was Sex and Rage by Eve Babbitt's. How many times do I have to say it? I'm an Eve Babbitt's girl. This story follows a young woman named Jacaranda. When we first meet her, she's a surfer, she's an artist, she's an LA native, and basically we find her when she's starting out in her 20s, and she's kind of living this like very like nomadic lifestyle, and she's finding herself in all these very beautiful and influential circles. This book has a lot of like barely any plot but a lot of vibes, because we kind of just see Jacaranda like going into this like social circle, like kind of losing herself, and then suddenly she wakes up from this like haze and she's 27 and she's like, what the hell am I doing with my life? I honestly think this is like the perfect book for like any 20-something who's like, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing with my life. Sometimes it's just fun to read about a character who's going through things like that, so you feel like less alone. Like you're like, wow, this is just the experience of being a young person. Even though this book is mostly vibes, I feel like there's something you could totally take away from this. For me, like I was really reading into like the imagery and meaning of her name being Jacaranda. There's a lot of like water imagery throughout this book, which I thought was like really interesting, especially because she's literally like adrift in life. Because of this book, the word golden and the phrase "you're here," so simple, but those will forever be changed in my brain, kind of similarly to how "Call Me by Your Name" changed the word later for me. And also in true of Babbitt's fashion, she had to insert herself into this book because there is a moment where Jacaranda is at a party and she sees the Julian Wasser photograph of Marcel Duchamp playing chess with a naked woman. And she is that naked woman. Yeah, that was Sex and Rage. Okay, so July was kind of a chaotic reading month for me, partly because towards the end of June and beginning of July, I was traveling, and so I brought a lot of books to kind of keep me entertained. And the first book that I finished in July was Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I have the translator right here. It was translated by Ginny Tapley Takamori. This is another book that I feel like has been super hyped up on the internet. This book follows a woman named Kaiko. She has been working in the same convenience store since she was 18. We find her now and she's 36, I believe, and she's still working in the same convenience store within the same position, and she's very content with her life in this convenience store. However, all the people around her are very concerned for her because she hasn't risen up in the rankings. She doesn't really have any friends and she doesn't have a boyfriend, and Kaiko doesn't really care about society's expectations for her really until a bitter, loud man kind of is hired at the convenience store and kind of makes her rethink her situation. I won't spoil it further from there, but that's kind of the gist of the story. I thought this book was like okay. I can't remember if Kaiko is like canonically on the autism spectrum, but a lot of people online are reading it that way. I think she might be just because of what she says about her childhood, but I actually cannot be too sure, so I don't want to say that she is on the spectrum, but I just thought this book was okay. The one thing that was so beautiful about it was the way that Murata describes the convenience store. Like, I just wanted to like live in one after reading it for so long. And I do feel like her critiques on society were like very poignant without being like oversimplified or over explained. When I was reading this, I actually had a layover in the Tokyo airport, and I ended up going to a convenience store in the airport because I just was thinking about these descriptions all flight long. But yeah, that was Convenience Store Woman. The next book that I finished in July was Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It by Caitlin Tiffany. I need to tell you all right now, this whole book is about One Direction and how the One Direction fandom changed the internet, or at least that's Caitlin Tiffany's argument. I didn't even realize that the title, Everything I Need I Get From You, is from a One Direction song. I'm clearly the fakest One Direction stan ever, but it's from the song I Want to Write You a Song, and I low-key hated that album, so... Well, I didn't hate it, but I definitely think it's one of the weakest One Direction albums, so like it didn't even process in my brain. You can tell this was like finished during quarantine, because like at the end they were talking about like Gigi Hadid and Zayn Malik having a baby, but then also like Olivia Wilde and Harry Styles, and I was like, excuse me, what? This is very up to date. I'm a social media person. Obviously, I make YouTube content, and I'm also like, that's my 9 to 5. I'm a social media manager. My experience and understanding of the internet has been heavily influenced by the way I've approached and immerse myself in fandom online. Like I think about like the Hunger Games, the Marvel fandom, and the One Direction fandom. Like those literally shaped who I am and how I've carried myself online. One thing about this book is it made me realize how my participation in fandoms and like being a fangirl have made me both an intellectual but also like the prime consumer for like so much popular media and like in general just for things. Like obviously like I said, I love One Direction, but I also love Marvel. This book honestly just made me realize that it's nice to be understood, but it's also nice to be commodified and to be, you know, the target audience for everything in advertising and in media. I'm slowly aging out of that, but it feels good to be an 18 through 35-year-old woman. You know, 2 of my favorite essays in this are called Shrines and Trending, and I thought it was really interesting because Shrines really dives into like the importance of Tumblr in fandom culture, and then Trending really emphasize the importance of Twitter in fandom culture. I'm someone who really was on Tumblr, and so my experience of the One Direction fandom was super different than some of my best friends who were living on Twitter. I would highly recommend to any One Direction stan, any girly. I definitely want to read more about like the history of fandom because I find that to be so interesting. But this is a great starting point because obviously it was like looking in a mirror. The next book I finished in July was A Bright Ray of Darkness by Ethan Hawke. Yes, the actor Ethan Hawke. And honestly, one of the few books I've read written by a man this year. Two things really inspired me to pick up this book. The first was Ethan Hawke's very viral TED Talk on creativity. I watched that and I was like, I'm in love with this man again. I love him in Reality Bites. I loved him in like the Before trilogy. Like, I want to read this. The second reason why I really wanted to read this was because Jack Edwards here on YouTube said some really nice things about this book, so I decided to pick it up. This book follows a young movie star named William Harding who's returning to New York to be a part of a production of Henry IV, and he's playing Hotspur. William is dealing with like a lot of public scrutiny because he was recently in the headlines for publicly cheating on his like pop star wife. This book touches on a lot of different things. It touches on like themes of fame and celebrity. It talks really a lot about art and how it can be like a really healing medium. It also talks a lot about the rites of passage within like manhood and also within parenthood. I enjoyed reading this book, but I think I would have gotten more out of it if I knew the context of Henry IV. Like 3/4 of this book is spent with him like obsessing over his portrayal of this character and how he wants to execute this character. So I feel like part of this book is lost on me, but I still thought it was so interesting. I really thought it was hilarious how Ethan Hawke kind of made it a point that anytime like a character was diving deep into a monologue, like talking to William about his life and his philosophy, he always made a point to be like, they're really high on cocaine. They just snorted some cocaine and now they're going on this philosophical rant. And you're like, as someone who's been around like inebriated people, you're like, that actually checks out. I would definitely recommend this book to actors or people who are patrons of the arts or people who enjoy Just Kids by Patti Smith, because it does kind of delve into like the mind of an actor and like what he was thinking about and how he separates himself from the character, but also how he like merges the two. But yeah, that's A Bright Ray of Darkness. And then the last book that I finished in July was Milk Fed by Melissa Broder. This was my second Broder of the year, and I would definitely just like to say, heads up, if you are someone who really cannot read about disordered eating, it goes into a lot of heavy detail in the first third about eating disorders and disordered eating, so definitely look up other trigger warnings, but that's like the one that really comes to mind with this book. Milk Fed follows Rachel, who's a 24-year-old Jewish woman living in LA and working as like a assistant at a talent agency. In the early bits of this book, Rachel really dives into like the monotony of her routine and how restrictive her diet is. Felt repetitive, but I know that was probably on purpose. And then the story really takes off when Rachel meets Miriam, who's a fat Jewish Orthodox woman who works at Rachel's favorite like frozen yogurt stand. Soon Rachel becomes infatuated with Miriam, like she becomes infatuated with like her body, her faith, and her family, and like Miriam's relationship with food. Yeah, once you really meet Miriam in this, the book flies. Like I really could not stop thinking about this book. I finished it in like maybe 2 days. You could tell from the synopsis of this book that it deals a lot with like desire and hunger, you know, both sexual, both actually with food. This book is dripping with mommy issues, okay? That's all I'm gonna say. There are some details that Melissa Broder brings up through this lens that really like hit you. Like I thought about like, you know, the power of holding someone's hand, like the hand of someone you're really attracted to, or like the feelings one could feel when they get like a little hi text from their mom and you're like, what does this mean? Like, and it makes you kind of like spiral sometimes. There are just so many impactful moments like that within this book. This book will make you crave Chinese food because Miriam and Rachel are eating that a lot. Like froyo and Chinese food will be on your brain if you read this. Okay, now we've moved on to August, and the first book that I finished in August was Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This was a book club pick, and it was actually one of the few book club books I actually finished this year. I think this is also another one that's really hyped up and well beloved online. This book takes place in the 90s, and our protagonist is this woman named Casey. She's 31 years old, and she kind of feels stagnant in her life. She's been working on a novel for 6 years, and it has been going nowhere. She's been working in the same job as a waitress. She's under an immense amount of debt from school, and throughout all of this, she's also mourning the loss of her mother, which happened very suddenly. And the plot kind of takes off when she meets these two men, a man named Silas, who's a young man who's also a writer like her, and Oscar, who's a bit more of an established writer and who also has 2 young sons. And so she finds herself kind of figuring out not only herself, but also like, should she be with Silas? Should she be with Oscar? I would say the first 100 pages kind of drag on. I know you're like, 100 pages of dragging, but it really was because I think the author had to set up what Casey's life was like before this grief kind of took over her mental space. After the 100-page mark, like after we have met both Silas and Oscar, this book also takes off and is like so addicting to read. I thought that this book was honestly a great balance of Casey's journey as an individual and as a writer, but then also her relationship with Silas and with Oscar. Hello friends, Editing Tori here. I think that photo booth updated because I look so airbrushed, but the footage from this clip got cut off because I ran out of memory. It honestly was like a coming of age for your 30s. I feel like the fall time would be the perfect time to read it because it's set in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where Harvard is. I ran out of memory, so I had to re-record. The next book that I finished in August was The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides? I don't know. I did not Google how to pronounce his name before filming this. You asked me if you should read this book or watch Sofia Coppola's movie based on this book. I would just say just watch the movie because I do feel like Sofia Coppola took the essence of this book and presented it perfectly in that movie, and she also took the best lines from this book and inserted them into the script as well. So I feel like you're not really missing too much if you don't read this book. In case you didn't know, this book is told from the perspective of a group of boys who kind of became infatuated with the Lisbon sisters, who are a group of sisters from their childhood neighborhood. If anything, this book really does an excellent job of depicting how utterly out of touch these boys are. You can just really tell that these boys are living in a little fantasy because they think that because they've accumulated so much of the Lisbon girls stuff and also so much information through their like school records, through their medical records, that they know these girls. But then you're reading this and you're infuriated and you're like, if you just talked to these girls and had befriended them when they were alive, you would know them. You wouldn't have to be interviewing all these random people who used to live on your street to talk about these girls. That's really the only big thing I got out of it, and I thought those bits were done super well. Like, there are so many of my notes in here where I'm like, you don't even know them, like screaming. But overall, just watch the movie. But I enjoyed reading this book, and I'm really happy that I can knock it off my list. The next book that I finished in August is one that I think a lot of people finish in August, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I could not find this in stores, so I ended up listening to this book on audiobook, and I'm actually really glad that I did because Jeanette herself narrates this book. And I felt like I really gained a lot from hearing Jeanette perform this book because you can really tell that she is an incredible writer and an incredible actress, and you can also tell that this book really started out as a one-woman show because it reads so theatrical. Hi, Editing Tori is back because I lost some of this footage. I would not recommend this book lightly to people who are triggered by things like eating disorders and sexual abuse, but I'm sure a lot of you know this. Jeanette McCurdy's memoir is divided into 2 parts. It's divided into before her mom died and then after her mom died, and I thought it was just so interesting because you really got to understand what was plaguing Jeanette at the time. So like, for example, in the parts of before her mom died, she talks a lot about being a child and really wanting to please her mom. And to please her mom, you know, she went along with like going into acting and doing all these auditions and going to a million dance classes a week. Within those pages, you still kind of feel like her childlike wonder and like her faith that the people in her life will do her good and are serving her for her own like general well-being, even though you come to find out that that's not the case, that her mom really abused her and taught her how to calorie restrict. In the parts after her mom dies, you kind of see the way grief has changed her with Sam and Kat and kind of dealing with fame, but also like how she's dealing with like romantic relationships and in the ways that like her eating disorder recovery has been impacted by that as well. I don't want to say like enjoyed my time, but it's true, because it was such an interesting and well written book. I enjoyed my time with it, and I'm really like truly so happy that Jeanette McCurdy is like getting all this hype. And then the last book I finished in August was A Very Nice Girl by Imogen Primp. I bought this because the top says sweet bitter means normal people, and I've learned that I need to stop reading books that are compared to Sally Rooney books, because they will never hit the same. They will never hit the way a Sally Rooney book hits. I guess if anything, they both write without quotation marks, and they both talk a lot about power and money and proximity to that in a relationship, especially with an older man, but that's pretty much where the resemblances stop. I would definitely say this book is very closer to Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan. It follows a young woman named Anna who is an opera singer at this very prestigious London conservatory, and she is way less well off than all of her classmates, so she feels very isolated there. To make money, she's a singer at a jazz club, and she meets this older man named Max, and then Anna and Max end up having a relationship together, and Max kind of bankrolls a bit of Anna's life. Anna kind of has to come to terms with whether or not she wants to really commit herself to this relationship or commit herself to her art. I just thought this book was fine. This book was exactly what you would think it would be. It talked a lot about like, do you need to be a struggling artist in order to be considered like an actual artist? Like, what does it mean to be a struggling artist? What does it mean to struggle for art in general? And then also talked a lot about like the body as a tool in art, the body as a tool for sex, the body in all these other circumstances. And I just thought it was fine. I would say the first 100 pages were super strong and I was like so into it, and then it fell off for the second 2/3 for me. It was a nice book. Yes, that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you've watched this far, please let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if any of these books now spark your interest since I've mentioned them. I'll see you for the next one. Bye!